Hi, thanks for joining the breakdown. I'm James Sayer. Tonight we're talking about gun control. That's right. We've decided to bite off way more than we can chew and address this insanely complicated and important topic. And so we spent some time and really delved into it, and we're going to talk all about it tonight. It's gun control has been around. The issue's been around for a long time. It's a very contentious issue. The United States obviously has enshrined gun rights in our Constitution in the Second Amendment. So it's culturally very important to the United States that people be able to keep and bear arms. There's only two other countries that have constitutions in the world that have a right to bear arms within their constitutions. That's Mexico and Guatemala. That's it. So there used to be some others, but they rescinded their right to bear arms from their constitutions. And the constitutions in Mexico and Guatemala also have restrictions built into their firearm restrictions built into their constitutions. There are no firearm restrictions whatsoever built into the Constitution. It says the right to bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, of course, not be infringed, if you interpret that extremely loosely, meaning there can be no infringement on bearing any arms, obviously that is, taken to its, most extreme degree. That would mean people could be allowed to, possess fighter jets, and billionaires could own nuclear submarines with nuclear weapons, and they would have a constitutional right to have that. Obviously, that would not be acceptable to anyone rational. That's why there have always been bans on things like machine guns. Machine guns have been banned for a long time, since the 20s, with the Thompson machine gun. Caused a lot of problems with gang violence, and so the machine gun ban has been around for a long time. There was an assault weapons ban that existed from 94 to 2004, but that expired. So assault weapons have been around, and in popularity, in mass, their popularity has exploded in recent years. And particularly AR-15 is termed by NRA to be America's rifle. It's the top-selling rifle in the United States right now. Supposedly, 1 out of every 5 firearms sold in the United States is an AR-15. And we're going to talk about the role that assault-style weapons, including the AR-15, have in gun violence, particularly regarding mass shootings. So we're going to talk about that, but we have the situation in our country where we have a gun violence problem. It has been increasing. The peak, though, was in 1974. That was the peak of gun violence in our country, at least since we've really been keeping track of it. So it's down below that. It was like 16 people killed by gun violence per 100,000 people back then. Now it's lower than that. I believe it's like 12 per 100,000. So it's gone down, but it actually dropped quite a bit in the 90s. We saw a big decrease in gun violence, but we've seen what we'll say is since 2000, between 2000 and 2017, there's been a resurgence in gun violence. And so there was a big dip in gun violence in the 90s, but we saw it come back up between 2000 and 2017. And in fact, 2020 there was even more gun violence in 2020 than there was in 2017. So we know that gun violence is on the rise. Now, there's some dispute about whether mass shootings are on the rise because of how you define a mass shooting. So that is debatable depending on what type of methodology you use to define a mass shooting. But we do know for a fact, controlling for population growth, that regardless of population growth, that gun violence since 2000 has been on the rise. And gun violence in 2020 was higher than it was in 2017. So this is a problem. So in 2018, over 39,000 people were killed by gun violence, and that number was higher in 2020. So we know over 40,000 people were killed uh, by guns in 2020, well over 40,000. Now, most of those are suicides, right? The vast majority of deaths, gun deaths in this country are from suicides. So there have been a lot of people who have said, well, maybe what we need to do is improve mental health care. Maybe that's going to solve the problem. The problem with that is that there's a similar incidence of mental health problems in other Western societies, but they don't have the same level of gun violence because they don't have the guns. They don't have the same amount of guns, and most of these countries have very strict, much more strict regulations on firearms, access to firearms than the United States does. So that's the difference. It's not a mental health issue, though that is an issue. This is what we're looking at. All right, we looked at a lot of studies, and we found what we've considered to be the best one. It was a study by Rand that came out in April of 2020. All right, and it was an updated study from one they had done previously, I believe in 2013, and they looked at what they did is they did a meta-analysis of over 123 different studies regarding different gun control policies to see what worked and what didn't. And so here's the thing: they reviewed thousands of candidate studies. All right, but they narrowed it down to 123. And one of the main criteria they used for narrowing it down was that all these studies had to show a causal link from the gun policy to a reduction in gun violence. Now, most gun studies actually don't show a causal link. They show a correlational link, meaning, this gun policy tends to be correlated with lower gun deaths, but they can't isolate it well enough to say, well, it was this policy that had the impact, that there are other factors that could have had the impact instead, like different cultural factors, social factors, things like that can make a difference in whether a state is successful in implementing gun control policies or not. Now, and that's the other thing about this study is they only looked at gun control policies at a state level within the United States. All right. So, there are limitations to the data because, every state's data availability is not the same. Right. And there's some severe reporting limitations within the United States about gun violence because the CDC has basically been barred from effectively barred from doing any kind of research on gun violence. Now, they're not officially barred from doing research on gun violence, but this is how it works. The Dickey Amendment was passed in 1997, and basically what it bans the CDC from advocating for gun control or for gun control policies. All right, but the CDC, in order to protect its funding, interpreted that to mean no research on gun control, that any research on gun control would be interpreted by, anti-gun control politicians, especially Republicans, to be an attempt to advocate for gun control. So they've stayed out of it. They have not done any research whatsoever in gun control because of the Dickey Amendment barring advocacy for gun control. So that's a major problem. There's a lot of holes and limitations to the data that's available about gun violence in our country because the CDC has been prevented from studying it. So that clearly is something that needs to change. It's repealing the Dickey Amendment. And the Arkansas politician who actually got that passed actually came to regret it years later. So while he was successful in getting it passed, he came to see it as a mistake. So that's an interesting point of fact to bring up. So anyway, that's the situation that we're seeing right now. We've got a gun violence problem, and we want to. It's not just mass shootings. It's not just crime. It's a combination, right, of mass shootings. It's a combination of crime. It's a combination of domestic violence, right? It's a common, and then of course, like I said, the overwhelming majority are from suicides, right? So anyway, they looked at looked at all these studies, 123 studies, and they determined based all these studies were able, these different studies they looked at made causal links between different gun policies. And they looked at 18 different gun policies to determine which ones were most effective. And this is essentially what they found, that there were two gun control policies that they found to be, that there was high evidence that was in support of that suggested that these two gun control policies had a high impact on the reduction of gun violence. Just two, only two, but they were basically child access prevention laws. That was one of the big ones. That child access prevention laws were one of the biggest ways of preventing gun deaths, right? From preventing children from getting access to firearms, right? And so that's accidental deaths, it's potential suicides, or even other shootings, right? Where I mean, there have been school shootings, right? Where had the children who use the guns not been able to get them, it might not have happened. So that child access prevention, that was highly effective. The other one is standard ground laws. And what that means is that standard ground laws have shown to increase gun violence, gun deaths, and not just justifiable homicides, right? That's the idea behind it, is that if it's going to increase homicides, it would increase justifiable homicides. That you would stand your ground. You don't have no longer have a duty to retreat if you're able to, if you feel threatened, but you're like, there's 38 states in the United States that have standard ground laws, only 12 that don't, right? So the standard ground, you don't have to retreat. Other states where you have a duty to retreat, and the minority of states that do, it means if you're threatened, but you have a means of retreating from the situation, you are legally obligated to retreat. Right? But in those 38 states, you don't have that. What they found is that law increases gun violence because they don't want to back down. They don't have to back down. There's no real legal mechanism, right, or incentive for them to back down. And anyway, what they found was it didn't just increase what would be considered justifiable homicides. It increased homicides across the board, justifiable and unjustifiable. So those are the two big ones, that if we could repeal all the standard ground gun laws, and if we could make sure that everyone, had their guns locked up, that there was a law in place that held you accountable for having your gun safely stored, locked up, so that your child couldn't get access to it, that those two policies would have the biggest impact on reducing gun violence within this country. Those two things. Now, the child access prevention law, that's a great idea, and it could be passed at the federal level, and it should be aggressively pursued. Now, the repealing of the standard ground laws, theoretically, you could pass a federal law that says, you have a duty to retreat and override all those state laws. But that would be seen as insane federal overreach by probably most people in this country, since you got 38 states that have a standard ground law. So one, it would never pass, right? With 38 states that have standard ground laws, there's no chance that it would ever pass or even be considered. And then two, if it were somehow miraculously to pass, it would most certainly be challenged in the Supreme Court, which is heavily conservative at this point, and would likely be overturned. So that repealing the standard ground laws, that's got to happen at the state level. That a federal law is not going to take care of that. That's not going to happen at the federal level. So what you need is Democrats got to get organized at the state level. We've let state organization go. Should probably take some tips from Stacey Abrams and how she organized statewide for the Senate elections earlier in the year in Georgia, on how to effectively organize a state campaign. That's going to be crucial state by state to be able to, and some states it's not going to happen, but there will be some states, probably, the more purplish states, more moderate states, that might be willing to switch over away from the standard ground law, if presented with the data, and they have responsible politicians and a populace that is understanding of that. But this is something that's got to be taken to the states. There's a battle to be won at the state level. So those are the two biggies: the highest evidence of the most impact of reducing gun violence. Those two things: child access prevention laws and making sure and repealing the standard ground laws. Now they had some other stuff that they found. Three things in particular that had a moderate impact, okay, on reducing gun violence. Not as much as the two I mentioned, but still had a moderate impact of reducing gun violence. And that's background checks. States that had background checks, they found absolutely reduced gun violence. They also found that waiting periods, having a waiting period reduced gun violence for both suicides and for crime. That if you have a waiting period, that is also proven directly with a causal link to show that a waiting period will reduce the number of gun deaths in a state. Now, so anyway, we'll stay on that. But I need my list. My memory's not as good as it used to be. So dealer background checks, the waiting periods. All right, those were two things that had like a moderate impact on reducing gun violence. Now there were some other measures that were shown to have a limited impact on reducing gun violence, meaning there's some evidence to support it, but not as strong as the high or moderate evidence. So those things were minimum age requirements, having a minimum age requirement, like raising it to 21, right? That they found that there's limited evidence to support the fact that raising the age requirements for firearms reduces gun violence. They also found that prohibitions on the mentally ill owning firearms also there's limited evidence. There's some evidence to show, right, that restricting handguns from the mentally ill will also reduce gun violence. They also found limited evidence to support banning assault weapons and banning high-capacity magazines, right? Limited evidence. That means that they found at least one study with a strong causal link, right? That showed that there was some link to reducing violence from that policy, okay? And that there may have been like another one that was inconclusive. Other studies that were inconclusive, but there was one that had conclusive evidence that showed at least, to a limited degree, that these policies did reduce gun deaths within those states. Also, licensing and permitting requirements, right? Requiring people to have, a permit to carry a gun or to carry a concealed weapon, that is also associated to a smaller degree with reducing gun violence. And they also found that concealed carry laws, right, that in effect basically there is some limited evidence to support the claim that not having a concealed carry law in your state, meaning your state with what they call constitutional carry, you don't have to have a permit to carry a concealed weapon. Right, I think there's like 20 states in the United States right now that are considered like some type of a constitutional carry state. So you don't have to have a permit to carry a gun concealed in those states, right? In those states that there's more gun deaths. There's more gun deaths from that, right? But that the evidence supporting that is limited. It's not as much. it's not as strong a causal link as dealer background checks or waiting periods, and it's definitely not as strong a causal link as child access prevention laws and eliminating the the stand your ground laws, right? But there is some limited evidence to support these other types of measures. The other different measures that they looked at out of the 18 different types of gun control policies they found were inconclusive. I mean, there was no causal link that they could confirm and establish, either to a limited, moderate, or high degree of certainty that they reduced gun violence. All right, so that's basically what we're looking at. Okay, so now we've talked about the two big ones. Now the dealer background checks. All right, that's popularly supported. There's majority support in this country for background checks. So that's something that could get passed at the federal level, right? And then obviously waiting periods generally tends to have fairly high support. That's probably also something that could get passed at the federal level as well. Um, so those are two things to consider. Strongly consider, a federal waiting period of like 2 weeks before you're able to get a firearm, right? To actually purchase one. And in fact, in a lot of cases, there is a waiting period already. When you go to purchase a firearm, you have from a licensed dealer. Okay, if you go to a licensed dealer, they got to run a background check on you. And if you go, sometimes it'll take 2 or 3 days, but quite often, especially if it's busy, like it has been lately with everybody buying all the guns, it'll take a couple weeks, maybe longer, right? So there's kind of a built-in waiting period there, but it's not official. That's all determined on the demand for background checks at that moment, right? If things are slow, that background check can go through pretty quick, a day or two. If it's busy, then like I said, it's 2 weeks. So it's not a guaranteed waiting period. So if we had a federally mandated 2-week waiting period, that would reduce gun deaths, right? That would bring them down. Background checks, not just to licensed dealers, which already exists, right? Licensed dealers already have to run background checks on people. But for unlicensed dealers and for gun shows, what they call the gun show loophole, if they close those loopholes down and everybody has to pass a background check to purchase a weapon, that will also reduce gun violence. Not to the same degree as child access prevention laws or eliminating stand your ground, but it will bring those numbers down. Now, let's talk about for a second here about the fact that, all right, you do a background check. What are they doing? What they're checking to see is your criminal record. All right, so certain people are banned from having weapons, right? Felons, okay. Problem is, most felonies are actually non-violent, okay. So we need to do a better way of identifying who is a violent offender. Right? And again, that's going to go back to repealing the Dickey Amendment and allowing us to be able to do more rigorous study of gun violence in this country. Because right now it's a patchwork of pulling data from all these different states, right, with incomplete reporting. So the data we have, right, is incomplete at best, right? But we're making the best out of what we got. All right, so repeal the Dickey Amendment, but it's all right. So it's not just felons, right? It needs to be Rand also determined that there was a causal link between limiting access or restricting access to firearms for people convicted of domestic violence offenses. Right? So if you make it so that anyone who's convicted of a domestic violence offense, and most of those are actually misdemeanors, not felonies, right? As most violent crimes are actually misdemeanors, not felonies. So we need to have that added to federal legislation that says within these background checks that you run, you're not just checking for felons, violent felons, right? But that you're checking for violent misdemeanors, people who've committed repeat violent misdemeanors, and people who've committed domestic violence and been convicted of domestic violence, that they should be banned from having weapons because of their past criminal violent behavior. That was also shown to be have a moderate impact on reducing gun violence. So you want to run that background check, but it's also, you got to get not just the felons, right? Not just the people dishonorably discharged, um, right? But you also want to make sure you get people who've committed those violent misdemeanors, people guilty of domestic violence. You want to make sure the guns are out of their hands, because a lot of the mass shooters, a lot of people who've committed mass shooters or otherwise criminals, they have some kind of misdemeanor history, violent misdemeanor history. So if you deprive all those people of being able to get access guns, that's going to reduce your gun violence. So it's important that that be brought into any kind of if you're going to expand universal background checks, right? Not just to the licensed dealers now, but to everybody. You also want to make sure that you're making sure that violent misdemeanor offenders and domestic violence offenders are not getting access to weapons either. Those things will all make a big difference. Now, these other things I mentioned, things like minimum age requirements, prohibitions on the mentally ill. All right, prohibitions on the mentally ill. That's popular. Like, most people agree with that. Like, experts and the populace in general, strong majority support for keeping handguns, firearms out of the hands of people who've been determined to be mentally ill and a danger to themselves or to others. Right? There has to be that determination that they've been a danger to themselves. All right. So we've got to have the proper kind of reporting that links up all the different systems from the different states and localities within our country, right? And all the dealerships, right? Private or otherwise, licensed, private or otherwise, we've got to have all these systems linked up. Now that's going to cost some money. That's a chunk. But if we can drastically, or even to a small degree, reduce our gun violence, that would be worth it. That would be money well spent. But it's not a simple solution. It will involve a lot of integrating different computer systems to be able to communicate with each other in real time, so that reporting is accurate and useful, right? So yes, there will be that will have to be budgeted in the component of how much it's going to cost from an information technology perspective to make those systems at a national level be able to talk, right? Talk to each other and communicate, and not lose vital information about who shouldn't have access to a firearm. So these are the key items. Now the assault weapons ban, like I said, that has limited evidence supporting the argument that it reduces gun violence. Some evidence supporting it. Now, assault weapons are not used in that many shootings. They're in a small minority of shootings in this country. Most shootings that occur from handguns. By far, most shootings occur from handguns. Those are, that's what's used most. So really, if you wanted to, theoretically, right, if you were able to get rid of all the handguns, right, if you could magically wave that wand, right, that would reduce most of the gun violence. But you can't do that because we have over 400 million, I think it was according to the National Sports Shooting Federation or whatever, the NSSF, I believe is what they're called, that they estimated over 430 million guns within the United States currently. All right. So, one, you're not taking any guns away, not in this country. There's no support for any kind of confiscation from anyone other than a violent criminal or someone who's like a danger to themselves. There's not going to be any confiscation, like where other countries might be all right with that. Their culture might support that. Our country, that's never going to happen. You got 430 million guns, probably maybe more than that. Who knows, floating around. Assault rifle wise, I think it's like the estimate's around 20 million, approximately. They think there's 20 million assault rifles in this country. I think the NRA estimated something like 8 million AR-15s in private hands. not in civilian hands currently. According to the NRA, they call it America's rifle. It's the most popular rifle right now because it's an excellent assault rifle. It's highly efficient at doing what it does, which is killing people very quickly and effectively. Um, so the assault rifle gets a lot of attention because it's been used in a number of high profile mass shootings. Um, it has not been shown. It's it if you get rid of the assault weapons, it the evidence isn't that strong that it's going to reduce gun violence overall. Well, there's some limited evidence to suggest that it may. There's much stronger evidence, actually, very strong evidence, to make the case against the assault rifles or assault style rifles, because they're more deadly, right? They're more like per shooting. An assault style rifle, like an AR-15 or an AK-47, is going to be more deadly than a handgun, because the rounds that are fired from an assault rifle move at a much higher velocity. Uh, that combined with the small size of the shell, right? A 223 caliber round that's typically fired from an AR-15 is like half the size of a 9mm bullet, but it travels at 3 times the speed, and so because of that, it is has at least twice the force of a 9mm pistol. So that gives you that it's much more destructive because of its speed, and also because the small bullet is going to break apart when it hits its target, and that breaking apart makes it more deadly when it hits its victim. So because it is such an effective killing tool, right? There's a strong argument to say, okay, we need to ban this weapon. And there is majority support in this country for an assault weapons ban. Now, will it reduce the overall trend of increasing gun violence in this country? It's hard to say. Maybe a little bit, but if it does, probably not by a lot. The main thing that banning assault weapons would do, right? And that's going to be unpopular with a lot of people because it's America's rifle. It's very popular. It's a great rifle. It's a great assault rifle. It's well designed. It's very effective. It's easy to break apart. It's very accurate. Um, it is a great weapon. You can see why it's very popular. Um, it's it's generally, it's meant more for like urban warfare or like being on the battlefield, but you can actually use it for home defense if you use the right ammo. Here's the thing, right? If you're going to use an AR-15 for home defense, all right, that it could be an effective home defense weapon if you use a lower grade bullet, like around 55 grain. That kind of bullet's definitely going to break apart more easily. So it's not going to travel through your walls quite as easily, and potentially like kill your neighbor or somebody else, a neighbor walking across the street or something. That bullet is going to splinter apart when it hits a piece of furniture, or hits the wall or something. If you have higher grain bullet, higher grain 223, like they might use in the battlefield, then you got a problem. Then those bullets are going to go through walls and through the car outside, and hit somebody else. So if you're going to use it for home defense, make sure you're using a small caliber bullet. Now, there's a lot of people that would say, well, let's just ban handguns and weapons altogether. Obviously, we can't do that because the constitutional, it's in the Constitution, Second Amendment. It's a sacrosanct right. You would have to repeal the Second Amendment, which is a virtual impossibility in this country. You're not going to be able to repeal it. You can't even ban handguns because Heller versus Washington, D.C. ruled that a handgun ban is unconstitutional. So people have a constitutional right to a handgun. It has not been determined that you have a constitutional right to an assault rifle. And there's a pretty strong argument from a public safety standpoint on why you would restrict the sale of assault rifles. Again, doing that is not going to probably reduce gun violence by that much, maybe a little bit. There's some limited evidence to support that it would, but not by a lot. But what it would do is it would make the mass shootings and the shootings where they are used less deadly. The fact that It moves at a much higher rate of speed, that you can fire an AR-15 very quickly and far more accurately than you could fire a handgun. Right? Handguns are used the majority of shootings because they're easy to conceal. Um, if you got an AR-15 or a shotgun, they can see it coming. If you got a rifle, they can see it coming. Then you can't hide that. But if you hide a couple pistols or something, nobody can see you coming with that, right? And that's the reason why people want to ban high capacity magazines, because in some of these shootings, people have used semi-automatic pistols, uh, and they've used these extended clips, like extended magazines, right, that might hold up to 30 rounds before you have to reload, right? So that's the reason behind wanting to ban these magazines. And like I said, there's also limited evidence supporting banning these high-capacity magazines. Again, that's probably these two things, reducing, banning high-capacity magazines and banning assault weapons. They're not probably going to reduce the overall rate of gun violence by much, but they will reduce the deadliness in mass shootings and in shootings in general. Because if people don't have, if you have a handgun, it's going to be harder for you to aim accurately than if you have an AR-15. It's just easier to accurately fire a rifle, right, than it is to fire a pistol because of its weight and because of its barrel length. It's just much easier to do so. So obviously, there's 20 million firearms out there. A lot of them owned by law enforcement. But like I said, 8 million estimated to be in civilian hands. Those aren't going anywhere. We're not going to confiscate them. When we had a gun ban the last time, it was, whoever had those assault weapons then, they were grandfathered in. That would happen again. It would be grandfathered in as well. And that's pretty much always how they would do things in this country, is there's a grandfather clause. If you bought it before the state, you get to keep it, right? They would not try and confiscate. They know better than that. The Democrats know better. There's some liberals that would like to ban all guns, but the vast majority of liberals and Democrats know that it's never going to happen, not in this country, right? But what policies, what effective policies can we get passed and put in place so that we reduce the gun violence epidemic that we do have, and that we reduce the deadliness of the mass shootings that do occur, right? So trying to institute an assault weapons ban is a great idea if you can pass it, right? But you're not, like I said, you're not going to reduce the overall incidence of of shootings by that much overall, but you will make the mass shootings less deadly, right? Like the guy in Las Vegas, he killed 60 people, he wounded like 411. He would not have been able to do that with anything else other than an assault rifle. He had, I think it was like 14 AR-15s. I think 12 of them had like 100-round magazines. And they all had bump stocks so they could fire like fully automatic. He couldn't have done that with anything else. I mean, it's a deadly weapon, and it's an extremely deadly weapon and a highly effective weapon. But it's how much effectiveness will be in reducing the overall gun violence overall. A little bit maybe, but not that much. Not, it's limited evidence to support that, but it would make the actual mass shootings, right? And even according to that would make them less deadly, even according to trauma surgeons, right? That assault rifle bullets are far more destructive to human tissue, right? That if you get wounded in a shooting, but you get shot by like a bullet from a handgun, it's not going to be as bad. Like if you get shot from a 9mm pistol, bullet from a 9mm pistol, it's not going to be as bad as if you got shot by a round from an AR-15, right? Damage would be much worse from an AR-15. And so that's a crucial thing. And all right, we've been talking about gun deaths, right? Gun deaths. But here's the thing. It's not just deaths, right? It's also people that are wounded, right? There was another RAND study that was done that analyzed data from, I think, 2000 to 2016. They found that between those years that there was like 550,000 people hospitalized from gunshot wounds across that 16-year period. You know, that's a lot of people, and that was that it was almost, it came at a cost of almost the medical bills alone accounted for almost $3 billion worth of medical bills from, from people that got shot over that 16-year period. That's $3 billion a year in medical costs from people hospitalized from shootings in the United States. All right, that's a lot. They also found that's not including lost wages, right, from time they're not at work, right, and lost productivity from not being as productive. That's not accounting for any of that. Just medical bills alone is $3 billion that costs us a year just in medical bills, right? And it was there was another study done by Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine that found on average the average person who goes to the hospital with a gunshot wound has medical bills of around $95,000. So not only were you shot and have to deal with the trauma of being shot and then have to deal with healing, right? And then trying to get back to work, recuperating from that, dealing with your lost wages from not being able to work and trying to go through therapy, you got $95,000 worth of medical bills, right? That's not discussed that often, right? Is how many people are injured, right? And that's not even, we're talking injuries. How about all the people that are just traumatized, that weren't actually injured, but they were there, right? And we'll never forget that. Have some kind of PTSD from the shooting that they weren't technically wounded from, but they're traumatized for the rest of their life from it. Or all the people that are related to those people that were involved in the shooting, whether they were hurt or not. That traumatizes them as well. And the rest of our country, all of us having to go around now wondering, anytime we're in a crowd, anytime you go anywhere in a populated place, is there going to be a shooter? That just used to not be a thought that most people had, right? But we've seen, like I said, since 2000, there's been an increase in gun violence, and it is getting worse. It's getting worse since 2000, and it's increasing. It's increasingly getting worse. Our weapons are more deadly, right? The weapons are better now. They're more accurate. They jam less. You can put more bullets in them. The magazines are bigger. You can put more bullets in your magazines. Most 9mm now are double stack, means you can put twice as many rounds as you used to be able to put in a semi-automatic pistol. So like you have a 9mm, you'll probably have 15, 18 rounds you can shoot before you have to reload from a standard clip. That's not even an extended clip. So, that's one reason they want to reduce the clip size, right, to like no more than 10, right? Because somebody who's got 30 rounds in a clip, is a lot more dangerous than somebody who has to reload after 10, right? So that makes sense. Okay, so there's support. What support do we have in this country for passing gun control laws? Well, we have support for background checks. We have support for child access prevention laws. What else do we have support for? For keeping the guns out of mentally ill, right? We have support for that. We could probably also get enough support for keeping out of hands people who committed, violent offenses or domestic violence, violent misdemeanors. That side of it. You probably get enough support there. The problem is, right? Technically, there's majority support for things like an assault weapons ban and things like reducing the number of, reducing the size of the magazines that you can use for a gun. The problem is how do you pass something in such a divided Congress? Our Congress is super divided right now, and you can guarantee that almost no Republicans would vote for any kind of a gun control law, right? And to overcome a filibuster, you need 60 votes in the Senate to be able to do that. So you can pass whatever you want in the House. It's not going to matter in the Senate because you're going to get filibustered by Republicans, and you're not going to have the 60 votes you need to override that filibuster, right? You can't even get 50, right? Maybe you could get 50 votes, right, from Democrats. You got 50 Democrats right now, right? So maybe you could get 50 votes out of them. There's some conservative Democrats, though, might not be so sure about that. But whatever the case, they got to get rid of the filibuster because the Republicans they're gonna filibuster any kind of gun control legislation to death. They will. right, straight out of the gate. So filibuster reform or eliminating the filibuster is going to have to happen. There's no other way around it. There's another trick that you can get around some types of bills. It's called reconciliation, where you if you in reconciliation you only have to you can pass something with only 50 votes. But the problem with reconciliation is that legislation has to have an impact on spending, on the deficit and spending. So and that has to be its primary function. It can't just be incidental to that. It has to have a budgetary function. That is not the case with gun control legislation. You would not be able to use it for reconciliation. So there's no way to get around that filibuster unless you eliminate the filibuster, right? Which they can do. It would require some. It would be a bit of a challenge, but parliamentary wise, it could be done if they need the support basically of Joe Manchin. There's no way around it. There's a couple senators, Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema, Manchin from West Virginia, Sinema from Arizona, conservative Democrats that oppose eliminating the filibuster or even reforming it at this point, making any changes to it. Both they make similar arguments, basically saying that any kind of like the filibuster is meant to force compromise, require people to compromise, right? That's the whole point of the filibuster, that someone can talk endlessly and a senator can basically stymie a bill from being passed. They don't even actually have to talk the whole time. They can schedule other people to talk, right? So there are changes they could make. They could reform the filibuster to where they don't eliminate it, but they eliminate the 60 vote requirement to bring it up for consideration, right? Or they eliminate, they make it so that you have to talk the whole time and that you have to talk about specific legislation that you are opposed to, right? Harden the requirements for requiring you to keep talking, limiting the number of people that are allowed to talk, and limiting the types of topics you're allowed to talk about. They could, again, though, that required Manchin and Sinema's support. They're both against it. And they make the claim that this is too divisive a move, that that every time that the filibuster has been changed, that there have been changes to the filibuster numerous times, 2017, 75, 2013, 2017, I think 2019, there's no constitutional right to a filibuster. That's just a rule the Senate came up with long time ago. Long time ago, they came up with it. It actually, it's called Senate Rule 22. That's what they would have to revise, basically, right? And people have been filibustering in the Senate since the early 1800s, right? It didn't actually get its name, the filibuster, until the 1850s, right? But it's just increasingly been used more and more, especially since 2000. The use of the filibuster to stymie legislation, to stop legislation getting through, has skyrocketed. And so that's a problem now when we have all these urgent bills on just gun control, is that all the Republicans have to do to stop any kind of legislation that the Democrats want to pass is filibuster, because they're not going to support, as intransigent as the Republicans have become. They're not going to support anything, almost virtually anything that the Democrats put up. Certainly not a gun control bill. So somehow Biden and the Democrats have to find some way to bring Manchin and Sinema around to reforming or eliminating the filibuster so that they will be able to pass gun control legislation in the Senate by 50 votes, or by 51 votes. You need 51, which you'd have the 50, hopefully you'd have the 50 Democrats, and then you have Kamala Harris, the vice president, presiding over the Senate as the tiebreaker. Now, if the gun control legislation is moderate enough and reasonable enough and well crafted enough, you might be able to get maybe 2 or 3 Republican senators. Not likely, but maybe you could get a few of them to cross over. But it's still not enough to overcome the filibuster, right? So Filibuster's got to go or be drastically reformed. There's no way around that. So obviously, they make this claim. There's a few things that the Democrats can do. They have to show a willingness to reach across the aisle. They have to be very aggressive about it. They have to be very insistent on trying to engage Republicans in negotiations and making deals and working with them and trying to come up with compromise solutions to be able to pass these types of gun control laws. Now, if you're like me and you've been paying attention to things a little bit, the chances of that happening aren't very high. The Republicans, for a number of years now, have been extremely stubborn about passing anything supported by Democrats. So it's very unlikely that you're going to see much support at all for gun control legislation from Republicans. So it's really going to be pretty much a Democrats only show, right? But we want to pass things that are going to be effective. The child access prevention laws, and then take it to a state level and try and repeal the stand your ground laws at the state level. We got to get organized at the state level. Democrats have let the state organizations deplete. We were never that great at state organizing. Definitely let it go under Obama. And we need to build those state organizations up if we want to have a successful gun control campaign at the state level. But there are some things that the big things I mentioned, right? Child access prevention, right? That's a must-have. That is a part of federal legislation. It's got to be in there, right? Universal background checks. It's got to be in there. Won't be as effective as child prevention laws, access prevention laws, but it will be effective. And so it should be in there. They should be universal, all sellers, licensed or not, and they should be doing background checks on violent misdemeanor offenders and the mentally ill, people who are a danger to themselves, right? People who've been convicted of domestic violence. Those people should not be allowed to have guns. So that should all be kept in, and they should also get waiting periods in there, right? Those are all important things to include. Now, there's some other nice to haves you could put in there, like an assault weapons ban, right? Which has majority support, right? You might be able to get that passed, right? There's some other stuff like reducing the magazine size or having a national federal law requiring that everyone who has a concealed weapon has a permit. The federal law requires if you conceal carry that you have the permit. There's some limited evidence to support that's going to reduce gun violence. It's going to be very controversial. So that might be one of those things you trade, right? You can have some other things in there that maybe aren't as, like the age requirement, right? Trying to raise the age requirement for firearms, right? Or for handguns at least to 21, right? There's a lot of these little things that might make a little bit of a difference that if forced to, you can get rid of if you had to, as long as you make sure that the big stuff gets through, that those child access prevention laws get through, that the universal background checks and waiting periods get through, that you could sacrifice some of the lesser things that you're going to want to put in there because you're going to have to trade down, like you always do in any negotiation. You've got to give some stuff up, or the other side doesn't feel like they've won anything. So you want to put some stuff in there that you're going to be willing to give up if you have to. Put your nice to haves in there, right? The stuff that you want, those things that might reduce gun violence, but not as much as the child prevention laws, right? You've got to have that, and you really want to have those background checks too, and you want to repeal that Dickey Amendment. That's important. Is it a must-have? No, but it's a pretty important nice to have. If you can repeal the Dickey Amendment, that would be super important. It's not as crucial, like, got to have those child access prevention laws. That's number one, right? And a lesser two, that's the universal background checks. And then number three, that's the waiting periods, right? All the other stuff is a nice to have, but I will definitely say repealing the Dickey Amendment is probably the most important nice to have. That's going to let the CDC do serious research on gun violence in the country, give us much better data on what works and what doesn't work, right? Because guns aren't going away in this country. They're too popular here. People want to own firearms, right, to defend themselves, right? It's in the Constitution. There's very little support for repealing the Second Amendment. It's not going anywhere. So if you want it, all right, so we got a bunch of guns, right? We want to get them off the streets. It's another nice to have would be a federal buyback program that's rolling, meaning it's year round, and people can sell back their guns. You can get guns off the street that way. Now, how many you're going to get? Not enough. There'll still be hundreds of millions of guns out there, plenty, right? Plenty of guns, but you could get the ones. You can get over time. You could get a lot of guns off the street, illegal and otherwise, and reduce the probability for gun violence to some degree just by reducing the number of guns floating around out there. The more guns there are, the easier access there's going to be to get to them, right? So reducing that number the overall number is going to reduce the probability of them being used to some degree, right? So some kind of buyback program is another nice to have that we should consider putting into federal legislation. So that's a good way that we can get guns off the street, and we can use those firearms for law enforcement or military, or we can sell them to other countries to use in their military, or we can just recycle, right? But we get them off the street. But there's no mandatory confiscation, right? You don't have to get rid of your gun. And that's the thing. Fox News, what they're going to do, Democrats, you got to be ready to go with your messaging, which is a big if, because Democrats typically aren't very good at messaging. They get bogged down in all the minutia and, don't always know how to talk to, like, a lot of everyday folks, right? So, you got to be able to keep it simple. You don't want to get too complicated with people that don't follow politics or that don't follow detailed policy analysis. You got to keep it simple for them. And you got to make it clear, we're not coming to take your guns. Okay? We're not coming to take your guns. We're not going to come. We're not even if we were to ban assault rifles, even if that were to happen, right? Assault style rifles, that we're not coming to take them. Everybody's got one. You got one, right? Everybody's got all your extended magazines. You can keep them, right? It's just after this period, you're not going to be able to purchase them anymore. And you're not going to be able to sell them to people. It's going to be illegal for you to sell them, right? Now, the magazine thing, people are going to be able to trade those things like, baseball cards. There's no way to track who's got what. But, after a certain date, you just won't be able to purchase a magazine that shoots more than 10 rounds, right? Or you won't be able to purchase, an AR-15 or an AK-47 any longer, right? If the gun ban's in place. But you'll be able, if you have one already, you can keep it. Now, the problem with the assault style weapons ban is that if it's going to go into place, or even if it's perceived it's going to go into place, that's going to boost AR-15 sales. There's going to be a panic buy. And you see that anytime it looks just like it looks like there's going to be a Democratic president's going to win, you see a panic buy, right, to get guns. Right. So if the assault weapons ban does get passed, you expect a huge panic buy of AR-15s, AK-47s, all those assault style rifles. People are going to snatch them up as fast as they can, get them while they can. So that's a downside to the assault weapons ban. But you can somewhat counter that with a buyback program that can snatch a lot of those AR-15s that get panic bought. In the next couple of years, you buy them back, right? And somebody's short on cash. So that a rolling buyback program, I think, is an excellent idea. But potentially, it's a good nice to have, but also potentially something you can trade if you need to, as long as you keep the most important stuff, which is that National Child Access Prevention Law, right? That you get that in place, you get the universal background checks, you get waiting periods in there. Those are the big ones. You can, if you have to, sacrifice everything else, right? But get the main things passed, right? And communicate to people that we respect your right to bear arms, right? To protect yourself, your family, protect your home, or even, to be a part of some militia if things should come down to us having to fight, to keep our country, which seemed like an absurd idea until January 6th. It seemed like, we have a militia, we have the National Guard, that should be enough, right? And it should be enough. The National Guard should be enough. We have a military, we have police, we have National Guard. That should be more than enough to take care of it. But unfortunately, we have a lot of lunatics in this country that want to overthrow the government, want to overthrow a duly elected president. They want him out. Regardless of the fact that he was elected by a majority of Americans, they're willing to resort to force and treachery and lies and conspiracy theories and terrorist attacks on our Congress to remove uh, uh, to prevent our duly elected president from becoming president. And so you can be forgiven for thinking, I might need an assault weapon simply to try and protect my country from some of its countrymen. Sadly, that is the sad state of affairs, right? Um, that's what we're looking at. So that's gun control. That's our discussion. That a lot of gun control advocates are now referring to it as gun safety, and I support that uh, because it is a gun safety issue. It's a public safety issue. Gun control has been used by the right in this country for decades in a negative way to portray any kind of effort to reduce gun violence, right? As government overreach. This aggressive communist government coming to take away your guns. That's that's the standard approach that the right uses to scare people in to opposing any kind of gun control legislation at all that might help make us safe. So expect them to break out all the all the things they can do to scare people into not supporting gun control. So it's important to make sure that people understand we're not coming for your guns. We respect your right to gun ownership. We just want these well established policies that are supported by have strong evidence supporting their effectiveness, and also have strong majority support within the country, right? Meaning that, all right, you pass a bunch of gun control laws, but there's strong majority support, so there's not going to be a big blowback. There's not going to be a negative reaction. Like if we banned a bunch of stuff that was unpopular, right? That if we did some unpopular move, that would be like a major blowback, right? A negative. You could expect like the 2022 elections are already looking sketchy for Democrats, with some Democrat politicians retiring, and we have this very thin majority in the Congress and Senate already. It's already looking like Democrats' majority is threatened, right? So you want to make sure that whatever legislation you pass isn't going to have a negative impact uh, in 2022. So, it'd be great to pass gun control in 2021 and then have it repealed in 2023 if Republicans take the House and Senate, because there was a negative reaction to enacting policies that were not popular. So you don't want to make sure that you enact policies that have popular support, like child access prevention laws, universal background checks, things like that, right? That have popular support, waiting periods have popular support, um, and that's the most important thing, that you get these things passed. There's not blowback, right? We we've got to Democrats. It's very important that you win in 2022. So you've got to come across. You've got to be moderate in your approach, right? If you want to appeal to all those moderate and like left-leaning independents or middle-of-the-road folks that sometimes vote Democrat, sometimes the swing voters, right? You don't want to scare them away with anything that comes across as too aggressive, too much government intervention, right? That doesn't have strong popular support. But the things I mentioned do have. The good thing is that the things that are most effective do have strong popular support. So we should be able to get those passed, but we do have to get the filibuster either reformed or repealed. So we got to find some way to bring Manchin and Sinema around to, whether that's making the effective argument that, look, we've tried everything we could to bring Republicans around. We've tried to be good negotiators and compromisers. You've seen it. We've tried to do everything you've wanted, and they still won't do it. Will you now relent? Right? That's probably not going to be enough. I don't know who knows. We haven't done a detailed psychological analysis of Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, but there's a pretty solid operating assumption that the most appealing thing to politicians is power, right? Whatever it is, we have to find that thing, that precious, Gollum's precious from Lord of the Rings, right? What is that precious for Mansion? What is that precious for Cinema? What is that thing they really need more than anything, that they want and they crave more than anything? We got to find their precious, and we got to tie that. We got to tie their precious to ending the filibuster or reforming it so we can pass gun control legislation. Not to mention a bunch of other legislation that won't pass unless we end or reform the filibuster. So crucial that we do that. So this concludes our episode on gun control. There's a bunch of stuff I'm sure I haven't discussed that I would have liked to talk about, but it's a lot to chew on and it's a lot to think about. I hope you consider these ideas. Again, repealing that Dickey Amendment is really important too, right? It's we need to be able to rigorously study gun violence to know what works and what doesn't work. And so we're kind of driving in the fog a bit with patchwork data from all the states. So repealing that Dickey Amendment is another thing that should be in any federal legislation. But again, it's all about the filibuster at this point, right? And again, it's all about Democrats communicating the message that we respect conservatives, we respect gun rights, we respect you, and we want to bring people into the discussion. We want to work things out. We want to be fair, right? And that the bottom line is public safety. It's not about government control. It's about reducing the number of shootings in this country and the number of shooting deaths, and the number of shooting injuries, and the number of mass shootings, and making those mass shootings not only fewer, but less deadly, right? And that there are things that we can do to lower those probabilities that have been proven to do so, and that we're not going to give up, right? There are some people that there's nothing, you're never going to convince them. Sadly, only about 48% of, according to Pew Research, only 48% of Americans think that gun violence is a very serious problem in this country. Now, the vast majority of Democrats, over 80%, think, yeah, it's a very serious problem. But it's like a small percentage, less than 20% of Republicans feel that way. So very, very big partisan divide in this country on whether gun violence is a serious problem or not. But it is on the rise. I mean, there's no question about it. It is on the rise, and there's a lot we can do to lower those numbers. But we have to be smart about how we do it. Some things we can pass at the national level, like I already talked about. Some things like stand your ground, that's got to happen at the state level. That's going to be a statewide campaign. But the more states that can repeal stand your ground, the better. Because Rand came away loud and clear in their study of all 123 different gun control studies that they studied, that was one of the the most crucial and most high impact ways to reduce gun violence, right? Was eliminating the stand your ground laws. That was one, and then the child access prevention. Those are the two big winners, followed by, again, universal background checks for all dealers, private or otherwise, gun shows, and then waiting periods, right? And that those background checks make sure you're scooping up folks that have committed domestic violence and have been convicted of it. People repeat violent offenders of misdemeanors, right? That needs to be changed. These are important changes. Think about these things, right? Assault rifles, right? It'd be nice to get rid of them if we can, but that's going to make the mass shootings that they're used in currently less deadly. It'll be right that the mass shootings could potentially be less deadly. It's not going to reduce the overall number probably by that much, but the fewer assault rifles out there, the mass shootings that do occur, if they're just by handguns, those mass shootings will be less deadly than if they were with an AR-15 or an AK-47. So there's a lot of nuance here. We may actually return to this topic again at some point to talk about any holes or things that I've missed, right? There's a lot here. I hope you found it interesting. It's a very serious problem. I've been wanting to get into this topic for a long time, years. And so I'm glad that I had a chance to. It's been very eye-opening for me. I look forward to us talking again soon. Our next episode is going to be a special mashup, a combination platter, if you will, of different topics. We're going to talk about reality winner who's in prison right now for divulging top secret information that revealed Russia's effort to get Trump elected president. Right? She confessed to that, and she was sentenced to like 5 years in prison. She's still serving a prison term. It's up in November. Should she be pardoned, or should her sentence be commuted? A lot of people think it should, because even though she violated her oath not to reveal top secret information, which she did to The Intercept, a news outlet, um, she violated her oath, but she did a public service by revealing what Russia had been doing. That had been hidden by the public from the Trump administration. Should she be pardoned for this? Good question. Also, we're going to talk about Joe Biden. How's he doing? Right? Is he doing good? What we're going to talk about that. What's he doing well? What could be better? What would we like to see him do? What do we think he's messed up? We're gonna talk about that. Obviously I'm progressive. I'm going to be liking a lot of what he does, but we're going to take a special look at what could be better and what we don't like. We're going to try and focus on that a little bit too. So we're going to talk about all that, and we'll have a special surprise topic to throw in there too, just for your enjoyment. So that's going to be the breakdown variety pack. That'll be episode 24 coming out to you soon. I look forward to that. It's going to be a lot of fun. As always, I enjoy speaking with you. And until the next time, take care.